We are live.
Hey. So, hi, I am Cloudysky Cosplay, and this is how to improve your cosplay sewing quickly in simple ways that look really impressive and really help your costumes last longer. So, a little thing about me, I learned how to sew by hand when I was 5 and then machine when I was 12. I've been cosplaying for about 5 years. I compete in craftsmanship competitions, and I've only taken probably 5 or so sewing classes. I pretty much just learn from YouTube and by trial and error, which I think is a pretty good way how to learn how to sew, but I definitely need a little bit more technical help. So first off, don't hot glue your seams, or as I mentioned at another time, staple them. It will really just help with the longevity of your costumes, and you want them to stay together while you're wearing them. And hot glue and fabric don't exactly make a super secure seam. Like it'll be pretty easy to rip, and you don't want your costume ripping at the convention. So where to start? So I think sewing is basically just like a giant puzzle with fabric. So take a look at like a t-shirt and think, how do these pieces fit together and why are they shaped like this? That's basically will help you learn how to read sewing patterns, and it will help with making your own or altering commercial patterns, and also definitely learn how to read the symbols on patterns. So like the arrows are basically which way the fabric has to stretch. That's called the bias. And if you don't follow that, like it's fine if you're not using stretchable fabric or four-way usually, but it will definitely alter the fit of the garment. So try to when picking out materials, try to put yourself in the world of the character and think about like what the climate's like, what time period is it, and if it's a fantasy world, like what do they do, how wealthy are they, and trying to match the costume to the world it comes from is an amazing way to understand why they wear what they do. And for example, like this is the Azrael Batman and the normal Batman. That whole comic series, it basically, spoiler alert, ends with Batman fighting him in a cave that's too small, and he has to take off all of his armor and he can't fight anymore. Then there's of course Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I think has some really quality designs because the characters can move. It doesn't really offer much in form of armor and defense, but they don't really need it too much. Hence why the picture on the far left is really impractical, because Aang's kind of a pacifist, so he doesn't really need a saw blade on his elbow. I think that's his elbow. So now on to specific types of fabric. So this is a swatch kit. A swatch kit, I used this specific one in a textile course that I took last semester. Basically, it's think of it like a giant scrapbook of fabric swatches and types of fabric, and inside, well, we had to fill it out ourselves. There might be ones that you can get that are already filled out. I'm not entirely sure. And basically, it's just you put the swatch, and then there's a bunch of information underneath it. And that way, you know what the fabric feels like, what it's made of. If you want it to be vegan, this will help you this will help you figure out if it is, because it's most of the fabric in there is plant-based or polyester. So don't be afraid to use fabrics with different textures, because it can add a new level of depth to your costume. And people should be more accurate with this than I am. Uh, Iron your fabric before you sew and while you sew. It'll make your life very much easier, because it'll make sure that the pattern pieces line up correctly. I mean, don't iron the fabric if it will melt. So, and then use starch. That basically just kind of acts sort of like an interfacing, but without it, it just gives it a little bit more structure. So follow the grain of the fabric. That's similar to the bias sort of thing. It'll stretch along that side. And you want that to be roughly followed pretty well, depending on what you're making. Like if you're making a pair of gloves, you want that to follow really accurately because that has to like stretch with your hands. If you're making like a bag, it doesn't really matter or something like that. And don't be afraid of hand sewing if pins and clips aren't working. Basically what hand basting is just sewing like pretty much really loose running stitches, which is just like the normal hand stitching where it goes up and down, and it's easy to take out, and it's really helpful when it comes to working with really slippery fabrics. Like if you want to put organza over something and like layer it, it'll help it stay in place much flatter. It takes longer, but it helps a lot. So use fabric that makes sense with your costume. To learn more about different types of fabrics, I would recommend getting one of the swatch kits if you can afford it. If not, just walk around the fabric store and feel stuff. It makes it easier when ordering fabric online if you know what type of fabric it is and what you're looking for. And there we go. Here are these. So I like to read some books when I'm working on a new project. These are some of the ones that I like. So the Smithsonian Definition History of Costume and Style, that's like a textbook. Basically, it just talks about different types of clothes and how they were constructed and why they were worn. Same goes for why they wear that, except that one goes more specifically by time period. And it gives better examples in my opinion, but the Smithsonian one gives better examples for construction techniques and just technique overall and like why and like the types of fabric. And then the sewing, the complete guide to sewing, it's just like just helps with if you don't know how to connect something or if you want to learn how to do something better. I'd also recommend actually reading the pattern directions because sometimes things aren't really clear. Like a sleeve might have a little bit of a gather in one place and it might not look like it needs it, but it has one and you don't know, and then the sleeves don't fit into the holes. So some tools that I like to use are obviously needle and thread with the sewing machine, and so then I like to use scissors, pinking shears, a serger, which is basically, I'll get into it later. I like to use an iron that has a steam setting because that really helps get the wrinkles out of natural fibers like linen or cotton, which have a very high ironing temperature. I like to use fabric clips, which are those colorful clip things right there. Word of advice, don't actually buy them at the fabric store. They're like $30 for 8 clips, and you can get them on Amazon. You can get like 100 for like $10. So yeah, then there's a rotary cutter, which is basically like a pizza cutter, but for fabric. It's very sharp. So if you're like not good, if you're like clumsy, don't use one. I've cut my hand many times. It just makes cutting long lines and strips of fabric much easier. It gives you a little bit less control, but to have a rotary cutter, you also need to have a cutting mat, which I just recommend for anyone who's crafting anyway, because it's much easier to replace one of those than a tabletop. I like to also use a dress form. That purple thing, which is basically just a weird stick of plastic that is good for turning loops and like poking corners out, and a bunch of other stuff. And also, well, I don't like to use this, but it's pretty essential, a seam ripper, which is used to take out mistakes. So, contrary to popular belief, there's actually a very big difference between shears and scissors. Scissors are the top picture. They are symmetrical blades that meet in the middle, whereas shears have a flat side, which allows for a smoother cut to make it easier to control and basically just keep your lines straight. Those are actually the exact scissors I use. They're on Amazon and they're like $16. I would definitely recommend getting them. They cut fabric like butter. And yeah, my sister stole my sewing scissors recently, and that was more so just my rage. So on to finishing techniques. These are things that people aren't necessarily going to see, but they will just make your costumes, they will take them up to the next level, because a lot of fabric frays, and when the fabric frays, it's going to make the seams much weaker and more likely to pull apart. And we don't want that. We want our costumes to, or whatever you're making, to stay nice and strong. This will even help with sewing with spandex and stuff. And you don't really need to do it, but if it's going to be stretching, I would definitely recommend doing one of these techniques. I'm not going over all of them. There are a lot. I'm just going over like the ones that I like the most. So I like serging or overlocking. It is by far the most expensive of these options. It takes the least time though, and it makes all of your seams look professional. So if you look inside, like, say, like a t-shirt, you're going to see that the seams have like this fancy, like swirly, basically just the bottom picture. And that's an overlocking stitch. It stops the fabric from fraying while also allowing it to continue to stretch. And it also cuts the fabric as you go. I have an Baby Lock Accolade. You don't need to get one that expensive, but I'm lazy and I wanted one with the air threading. So basically, sergers usually range from price from $200 to $4,000. I would definitely recommend going to a actual dealer and not Joann's, just because the dealers, they actually will give you like better information and the machines are better because they're coming like directly from the source, and they honestly are just so helpful. Next is pinking shears. This requires, so this is pinking. It requires pinking shears. They are much more wallet friendly, and they're not as durable, because I have found that even when I cut something like cotton with this, it will still fray over time, just slower. So basically for this, you need a pair of shears that either have a scalloped or a zigzag edge. These aren't, I like these. I find they're a little bit difficult to cut with, but that might be because I have tiny baby hands. But this works really well for like spandex and stuff, not as well as serging, but it's a good alternative. Next, we have French seams, which is basically when you sew your seam twice to encase the raw edges on the inside. This is really popular. It's been used throughout history for a very long time. I personally don't like it because it adds a little bit of bulk to my seams, which I have a distinct hatred for, but like if you like it, keep using it. It's very fancy. And it'll look great on the inside. So then there's the zigzag stitch, which is in my opinion, the best alternative to a serger, because most machines have a zigzag stitch. And it's a really good step before you actually make a commitment to buying one. It essentially does the same thing. It stops the fabric from fraying. You definitely have to pay attention a little bit more to make sure it actually goes over the edge and stuff. But yeah, I would definitely recommend trying that out. So now, or there are other, oh wait, I missed one. So this one takes the longest, but if you want something to hide on the inside, if you don't want this, like the lines to come out, say you're sewing on like an applique and there's a lot of stray fabric, that like leftover fabric, but you can't sew through the actual design. Basically what felling is, it's hand stitching one of the sides of basically it's stitching the raw edges down after folding them in on itself. And it was very popular during the Victorian era. This is definitely the most time consuming, and it's like the most manual labor, I would say, second only to pinking shears, because they're just like, it's actually cutting it. And it strengthens the seam more than simply hand sewn, which the whip stitch, which it's a whip stitch, is capable of. And yeah, I like to use this. I've used this on my Zelda costume and on a Katara costume that I made. And you can't see, I only like to use this on fabric that's layered so that I sew through the bottom, like the layer that's on the inside, so that you can't see the stitching on the outside. So now we're on to mock-ups. I used to avoid making these because I thought it was a waste of time, and it takes just as long as making your actual costume, but it will be worth it if you make your own patterns, and even if you don't, because like people aren't always shaped like how commercial pattern companies design and grade their patterns, so you have to alter it. This is a Yukio costume jacket from like Deadpool 2. This was one of 2 mock-ups that I made for this. But yeah, definitely use a cheap fabric, but make sure that it's a similar stretch. If you're using like spandex or something, I would definitely recommend, this is just what I do. I go to Joann's and then I buy like, if it's on sale, I'll buy like the ugliest color that I won't be tempted to use on an actual costume, so that I have that fabric specifically just for mock-ups or like a really ugly print. This is, yeah. And yeah, they take longer, but in the end of the day, it's going to make your costume look better. Now we're on to fit, which is the reason why mock-ups are made. So you want your costume to fit. So you should learn how to take your body measurements, and if you need someone to help you, just like ask a friend. This is the like measurements of where you're supposed to take them. I like to use this specific picture. And this is really important for knowing how to alter a pattern and how to pretty much just make your costume. And also it'll help you know if you need to add, depending on what type of fit you want. Like if you want it tight, you can go really close to your actual measurements, but with a seam allowance. And if you want it really loose, you can add a couple of inches or just 1 or 2. But if you add inches, it's going to get bigger, like it's going to be bigger than you think. So underwear with a purpose. So I'm not talking about like underwear, but like foundational garments like a corset, which was actually not used to torture women. It was to hold up their, like, sometimes many pounds of skirts. That's why it had the boning in it. It was basically the equivalent of what like a bra is today. And it was integral to the clothes were expensive back then, like really expensive back then. They wanted them to last a long time. And another thing that's like this is a petticoat or a crinoline, or like a hoop skirt is another term for that. And you basically just want that to get whatever shape you want, because if you like bodies, like hips don't go out that far. Just, it's not a thing that happens. That's an illusion with petticoats, which leads us into proportions. This is not super important in our body positive world, but this is still something to consider. So back in the olden times, they created the illusion of the ideal body type of the time. Obviously, this one is the really wide hips, and this would give the illusion of also a much smaller waist. And in like the 30s or 40s, yeah, in the 30s, like the 1930s, they would have, no, it's the 1830s, like sleeves that like pull your shoulders back so that you have better posture. They would often, it would depend on the era, but definitely the corsets with the big skirts was pretty much popular the entire time. Then they also had things called bum rolls, which enhanced the booty. But yeah, still something to consider if you want to make like a gown of some sort, or pretty much just anything that flares out. You don't want your costume to eat you alive, unless that's the point. If it's the point, then I guess that works. So I like to add quilting. This is the bottom of my Zelda skirt. So it just adds like a really eye-catching detail to your costume. And yeah, so that's 2 layers of the gold fabric, and then inside of it is quilt batting, which I then stitched the design on, and it looked really cool. Didn't show up in pictures, but it looked really cool. If you're gonna do this, definitely get matching fabric. If you just want it to be subtle. If you don't want it to be subtle, get like the opposite color, or just black, or white if it's black. And then another thing, you like using trim is a great way to hide stitching. Like there's a seam right there, that there's a seam like right in, obviously in between the blue and the gold. You can't see it. Also, there's like a hole that I accidentally made under some of that gold trim while seam ripping some of it out, and you can't see it. So yeah, so experiment with some decorative stitching, like top stitching. So a lot of jeans have top stitching. That's basically the orangish tan color thread right here. It will also help your fabric lay flat, and also learn how to sew by hand because sometimes you just can't sew things like that on a machine. An example of that will come up later. And so the default stitch length on most machines is 2.5 millimeters. This stitch length is actually not great for most apparel sewing because it creates a lot of holes in the fabric. If you're sewing with a fabric that does not self-heal, which means that the holes stay in forever, definitely go with a longer stitch. I would say that 3.5, between 3.5 and 4 is a really good spot. And next is something that I had to learn about for this panel, which is stitch tension. Most fabrics use a stitch tension of 4. Basically, this is how like tight how loose the top and bottom threads are. So for perfect, you want it to be even throughout, and then obviously if it's too loose, it's going to be too big on one side, and then maybe too big on one side if it's too tight. I don't touch it ever because I use a lot of the same types of fabric, not gonna lie. But you don't want it too tight because it could break your fabric, and you don't want it too loose because it can tangle your thread inside the machine, and trust me, it is not fun to clean up. So here's an example of some different textures of fabric. This is more of so the white on my Guitar costume is more of like it's more of a wide weave, and you can kind of see the spaces in between the threads, whereas the blue linen, it's more of a solid thing. And then I did some decorative stitching around the edges, which also don't show up in pictures, which is great because I spent like 3 hours doing it, but I know it's there, So it's a great way to make your costume stand out if you want to accentuate some sort of thing. So by trims, what I mean is the white part, it's a trim that I added to the pattern. Certain trims can be quite pricey, but you can also make your own. Making your own takes a lot of time, but word of advice, buy it online and buy the entire roll unless you just need a little bit, because trust me, you will use more than you think you need. I bought 10 yards of the gold for my Zelda costume, and I ended up using like 30. So yeah. Piping. So the piping is it's the gray that's in between the white and the blue. I made it myself because I was picky and I wanted it to be made out of suede. And it's basically it's faux suede. I took some cording, some cotton like string and cording that was the correct like diameter of how thick I wanted the piping to be, and I just cut out a bunch of strips of the gray suede and I encased it inside, and then I stitched it down. So it's kind of like bias tape, and then I inserted it in and I just stitched it. So now we're on to closures and fasteners. So there's a lot of these, some of them that I had never heard of. So basically, it'll help your costume lay more smoothly. For example, a zipper will pucker more than an eyelet if you want a lace-up back. So puckering basically will just be like wavy and things like that. And if you're like really technical about it, while the zipper actually might be more stable than the eyelets, depending on what type of fabric you use, it's still like, it will still put a strain on your costume. So closures are very tricky. They are seemingly simple, but when it comes down to it, there are challenges, and they require a lot of practice. I have found that hand basting zippers, whenever possible, helps, but that's mainly when I use stretchy fabric, like with my superhero costumes. Like for my Harley Quinn costume, I hand basted the zipper in the back because I could not get it even on the machine with pins. It just wasn't happening. So basically, let's think about this. So the bar and ring, they're pretty much, it's just like the hook and eye, which works really well for like jewelry. And just, I like to use hook and eyes for like capes. It's easy to use. They're really convenient. They have them at every craft store pretty much. If it really depends on like what type of garment and how much strain you're going to be putting on it. Like if it's like a belt, I'd recommend a buckle because belt buckles. But I've found that hook and eyes or like snaps, not like the sew-in snaps, the ones that you need a hammer. Those work really great. I use those for Yukio. Oh yeah, forgot this was in there. So Velcro. But don't buy the Velcro, like buy Velcro that you like, that is well rated on the internet. And even if it is adhesive Velcro, sew it on because the adhesive will come off like immediately, especially if you wash your costumes. But who washes their costumes? So grommets and eyelets, those are really fun. Also, you need a hammer for those. I'd recommend adult supervision if you're not an adult. So how to choose what type of closure to use. Zippers are great for most garments. I use them in most garments. Pants are a little tricky to do that in, so I just use elastic. Lace-ups with eyelets, great for a more historical look, or if you want to look real fancy. Great for corsets, and also for armor. That's not sewing. It's not my area of expertise. So snaps. Oh, no, I skipped buttons. Buttons are mainly for shirts and closing zippers or just various other details. If you're doing buttons by machine, read your sewing machine manual for how to do it and test it out. Don't just go right in on your nice fabric because buttonholes can be tricky. So snaps, they have snaps that you can hand stitch in, which are really great for like necklaces and other types of jewelry. I put my costumes through a lot of abuse, so I like to use heavy duty snaps that are used for like boat sails, and they have never failed me. It doesn't really matter what closures you use for the most part, but if you want a more authentically historical costume, definitely research it. The books that I recommended were really great for that. So now we're on to different types of zippers. My personal favorite is the invisible zipper. You should learn how to use these because they are great. And they work for most things. Dresses and skirts are what I mainly use them for, and on occasion shirts or leotards. Coils they're more durable than the invisible zipper. They're for like shoes. These are also plastic though, and then there's metal zippers, which are usually for jackets because jackets are like, they need to be more durable. So again, with the coil is plastic and it's less durable than metal, obviously, and that's used on a lot of clothes. Like that's I think a sweatshirt, and then they have molded plastic, which is used for a lot of sportswear. They also sell these at Joann's in many different colors. Word of advice: try to color match your zippers. It's not too important if you're doing an invisible zipper, but like you still try to. And then we have metal for like the jeans, which I have no experience using, but yeah. So now we're on to sewing with not fabric. This is one of my, I don't have any pictures of the other times that I've done this, but so using an unconventional material is a great way to make your costume look futuristic or like really ancient. So for my Birds of Prey Harley Quinn jacket, I used 10 gauge clear marine vinyl and plastic ribbon and caution tape, and also one metal zipper and a couple snaps for the details on it. Basically, you can't pin this material, so you have to use pattern weights, or as I like to say, whatever is around me at the time. So I'll like throw a book on there. For this wasn't too big of a deal. This was my second attempt at the jacket. I messed up the first time, not the sleeves, just like the vest part. Because I was using a commercial pattern, and believe it or not, this does not behave like fabric, so I had to alter the pattern, but it's not too big of a deal because marine vinyl, it's a very forgiving material because it's like $2 a yard. But yeah, so I actually had to tape the zipper down to make sure that it lined up while I sewed it. And this is definitely something you would use fabric clips for because they don't create holes in the fabric. And if you're sewing with something like this, definitely go very slow. And then for the sleeves, I just cut all of those ribbons and caution tape out by hand, and it's just sewn onto fabric. There's a lot of hand stitching that also went on in this. Basically, what I'm saying is sewing with non-fabric, just go slowly and just pay attention to what you're doing. So these are some of the places that I like to get fabric, and I really like them. So Fabric Wholesale Direct, great. I spend too much money there. Also fabric.com, Spandex World, Etsy.com is a great place to support local businesses and, well, just small businesses. They're probably not local. And look up local fabric shops that are family owned. I know a great one in Connecticut. If anyone's interested, they might be closed right now. I'm not sure. Have not been there recently. So now we're on to some sewing channels that I really like. Basically, they just like, some of them are more educational than others. And then they just really help with things like that. And then some sewing, helpful sewing blogs and websites. Mood has a lot of really awesome free patterns. They actually have some cosplay specific free patterns that I would recommend checking out. Oh, I didn't talk about this, but if you're printing a pattern and it's like a lot of pages, you can actually get them printed at Staples, and it might actually be cheaper than printing it at home because printer ink is expensive. I have done that several times. And yes. So I wanted to make sure, I did some research with the sewing websites. I wanted to make sure that both, like if you're more masculine, there is a men's sewing blog in there. And if you're plus size, there's also a plus size sewing blog in there. People asked me questions at my last panel. I didn't know how to answer them, and I wanted to learn. So yeah, oh yeah, okay, this went over quickly. So this is my social media, and that's all I have today.
Thank you. So one question I have is, with that Legend of Zelda cosplay that you made with that fancy gold trim, because I am very unfamiliar with using like something so delicate like that, but how do you sew on those trims? Like, do you have any advice? Just because they're so
An
like
insane amount of
pretty.
pins.
Uh,
I actually hand stitched them onto the sleeves, but if you look really closely on my Zelda costume, I gave up. I gave up sewing it on the bottom and just used a machine and just matching thread really. So but like metallic thread, like it's not great for hand stitching. It's more of a machine thing and just going really slowly.
is there any patterns that were a real struggle to translate when working with it?
Okay, so funny story time. I didn't know how to use sewing patterns when I first started sewing by machine and when I first started cosplaying. So I just made all of my patterns up until recently. The Harley Quinn jacket pattern that sucked. That was bad. I mean, and if I do use a commercial pattern, I pretty much butcher it to the point where it's not even recognizable anymore. Okay, so I really like using like really simple sewing patterns. Oh wait, no. No, I used a leotard pattern for when I made a Harley Quinn Power Girl costume, and it took me like 4 tries to get all the like color matches to line up.
Yeah, leotards are hard.
Well, it's not even that. They were like the leotard part, like making it was easy. It was just like the proportions of like the black to white transitions, not black to white, black to red. Oh, sewing boot covers, that sucks too.
So what do you do when you create your own patterns? Like what is your system for doing
I
that?
throw fabric on my dress form and then I cut it to the shape that I want. Or I'll like make like a base like piece and then I'll cut it up in this. I'll like draw the seam lines where I want them and then I'll cut them from there and then put it back together and then make another mock-up. Just a lot of trial and error really. Yeah, no, I don't use commercial patterns often. My Katara pants, like those, that was a commercial pattern actually. Wait, I skipped one of these. Skipped. Here we go. Yeah. So,
Okay.
like this was the example. I don't know why I was skipping like 2 slides sometimes. So this is like an example of why you should kind of pay attention to what type of fabric you use. So this is Amazon's version of Katara. It's a satin of some sort, which like you're not gonna wear if you're running from the Fire Nation. And then this was from AliExpress. It is a polyester cotton blend of some sort, which is better, but they didn't have synthetic fabric at that time. And then there's handmade, which is 100% linen, which is a natural fiber. The sleeves are spandex. That's not natural, but that's a technicality. And it just like, I feel like it just like kind of looks better in nature because it's not perfect. Like sometimes imperfections in your costumes just like add a sense of realness to them, I think. Yeah, that's pretty much all I have.
What competitions have you entered? Because you mentioned that.
Oh yeah, no, just like Rhode Island Comic Con. And I was gonna do Kineticons, but that got canceled. So
Oh yeah, I was gonna go to Kineticon this year.
all my other conventions that I was gonna compete in got canceled. So I just have to like I can just show off and like next year.
Have you done any virtual costume cosplay competitions?
I have not. Probably because I'm lazy and I don't like to get in costume all the time.
No, that's fair because at a con you wear it all day, but for a virtual you wear it and then take a lot of photos and videos.
Oh, it looks like the Schuyler sisters from Hamilton.
Oh yeah, like the
The Victorian underwear.
yes. I kept laughing at that. That's all I kept thinking about.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, like that's not a corset, that stays, but yeah, they do wear those in Hamilton.
I just love the way that looks because I know that's like a old way that women used to dress, but it always cracks me up.
Yeah, no, I think that learning the history of fashion, it helps a lot when
Hmm.
making it, even if it's like I don't know, like a cat girl in a ball gown. Like it's still gonna have to have, like, if it was like real life, it would still have to have structure to it.
Oh no,
Uh,
definitely.
and then there's just like costumes that don't obey the laws of physics at all, and I can't help anyone there because I avoid those costumes. That's pretty much all there is today.
Have you had any fabrics that were like a real struggle to work with and why? For people who are starting out and don't know about like the
Oh,
different types.
I have heard that stretchy fabric is hard to sew with, but it's what I started sewing with, so it's really simple for me. I think that stretchy fabric's more forgiving because you can, like, if one side is like stretching more than the other, you can just like pull it. Oh wait, no, I do know it. I know a fabric that sucked to work with. This gold, this is gold silk charmeuse. It is the slipperiest fabric I have ever worked with, and it was terrible to make this giant trim with. Because I did 19 of these patterns
Oh wow.
all the way around the skirt. It took me like 8 hours, and it just kept sliding. But I mean, like, it worked out. Satin is hard. Like, I don't like to sew with satin, but it looks really good, so I sew with it a lot. Uh, yeah. And it frays a lot. Sometimes it's easier if you finish your seams before, if you finish your garment pieces before you actually um like sew with it. Like when I did my Katara costume, a lot of the pattern pieces, since it's linen and it frays like no one's business, I would overlock all of the edges of it, even if it made it harder to turn inside out. But I didn't want it to fall apart, so gotta do what you gotta do.
And then for the Zelda, like, how did you do that quilting? Because I know you mentioned you put two pieces, but
Oh, the
like,
whole
did
thing.
you stuff that to make it look puffy like that?
There's quilt batting in there.
What is that? Because I'm
It's
unfamiliar.
so so they put actually did that on the bodice too. You can't see it because it's white, but and also I like upped the brightness uh because I was looking, because I kind of had a little bit of a sunburn that day. But yeah, no. So that costume is not comfortable. So quilt batting is basically like, like polyester stuffing they have for stuffed animals. It's basically like a flattened version of that that's sort of sold in yards, and you like, I didn't use it how it's intended. Like for the leotard part, which is completely quilted, even though you can't tell. I should have put a picture of that in. So it just makes it like more pronounced because it makes it puffy. Yeah, so it's kind of think of it like a comforter, like how it's puffy
Mm-hmm.
and stuff. It's not that thick. They have ones at Joann's that are that thick, but and I would just sew like details into it so that it added, because I didn't want to make it out of like Warbler or foam or something, because in the game it's like very pronounced. So I still wanted it to flow, but also have a little bit more weight to it. So the bottom portion is the only part of the skirt that has that. and I have not done it I haven't done it since Zelda. It's on the belt as well, and also on the like upper arm cuffs. There's a lot of quilting in this costume. I would not recommend starting with a complicated thing like the leotard. Maybe practicing. I did quilting camps when I was younger, so I kind of know how to work with it.
Mhm.
Straight lines are a great way to practice. You can also practice, you could recreate this sort of thing by putting like 2 layers of fleece in between. Have a similar effect. It would be much hotter, but it would still work. It's kind of like a thermal layer.
And then, like, another question I have too, because it's like always a little bit of a struggle, is when you see a character, what do you do to help translate that character into a cosplay? Because it's always so interesting, like how you mentioned, like that quilting to make it more flowy. So do you do a lot of planning and like touching different fabrics and figuring that out, or
Oh
do you
yeah,
just kind of
a
do it along the
decent
way?
amount.
What is your system?
I spent like 6 months planning Zelda out before I actually started making it. I like to put a ton of reference pictures into like my iPad on Notability, and then I'll take like the pencil tool and I'll trace around where I think seams are, like on like the art itself, and then I'll move it and be like, okay, this is kind of what I want the shape to be. And then I'll try it out with a mock-up pattern, try the mock-up on a couple times. For the actually, I patterned the tiara too. I patterned that at school. I like took basically a pencil. Yeah, I took a pencil and paper, and then I just sketched out. Actually, I have the pattern in a PDF that I can post somewhere if anyone wants it. And then I held it up to my head and was like, "That's perfect." And I cut it out and made it out of Worbla. The only things that weren't really planned in this costume were the belts. That was like a last minute. That was like a con crunch thing with E6000. I was going to make it out of fabric, but then after the quilting with everything else, I was like, nah, no, not happening again. Uh, no, even costumes like Katara, I planned out a lot. I didn't really plan on the detailed stitchings, but then I did it for like 2 inches, and I was like, dang it, looks good. Now I have to do the whole costume so it matches. Yeah, no, actually, I made this costume just like around like these boots. Like I got these online and was like, these are perfect because I can attach armor to them because there's eyelets in the back. Then I didn't do that. No, costuming for me is definitely a very big planning thing. I have like a folder of costume plans and I like to sketch things out. I don't know. I'm just like I'm a very visual person,
Mhm.
but that's just me.
This is also a random thing, but like, do you make shoe covers, and do you have any advice? Because I have some spandexy ones for Starfire, and then I usually put wedges in it to make it have like that like boot look. But I started noticing that it rips the corner of the shoe covers because of like, walking on it. Do you have any advice on shoe covers?
For boot covers, I pretty much just like if you don't want to do what I did for my Harley Quinn costume and super glue the fabric to the shoes, I usually just like buy really cheap shoes from Walmart that I can just like destroy. I put like hot glue on the inside just to like be like a buffer, or on the outside to be like treading. Maybe putting like a pleather and just stitching it, like hand stitching it into your boot cover, like near the heel. That would
Mm,
probably help, but it's also a heel and it's kind of sharp.
yeah.
know. I always when I do boot covers, they're always like flats.
Yeah, I usually do that too, but then I was trying to use wedges because, like Starfire, her shoes actually have like a heel to it. Like it's like a heel boot.
Yeah.
Um,
I cosplayed Starfire once.
Sorry.
I cosplayed Starfire once. Yeah.
Oh, you did? Which one did you do?
The anime. I was like a baby cosplayer. I was like 14.
Oh, that's awesome. I have the new 52. Okay, so I have the new 52
With the
suit.
lead guitar.
No, not that one. The one that's like a crop top. Is that new
Oh
52?
yeah, no, I do know which one you're talking about. Sorry, I was talking
Yes.
about Rebirth.
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Rebirth is a good suit.
I got that one, but then I have the anime hair because I like that hair better. Like I just love that hairstyle, like the red Teen Titans Starfire hair. So I kind of like fuse them.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly just because I struggle with the collar, and then I was like, yeah, I'll do this one, and it's like a long sleeve.
I made the collar
The
out of
shorts.
like craft foam and a giant googly eye that I painted green.
Oh, I did that too. You use like the googly eyes and you take it apart, and then you use that to make the gems with
No,
the glitter.
I didn't even take it apart. I just like painted the
Oh,
outside of it green. Like I was like beginner.
oh, that's how I made my gems. It used to light up, but it was because it was stretchy fabric. It kept pulling on the wiring. So that made it like really difficult to keep like the battery and the circuit connected. And so it was hard for me to always fix it, especially when it's tight. So I kind of like gave up on like trying to make all the gems light up, but I did have it like all light up at one point.
Yeah, I'm not really sure how to help with the boot covers.
I know. I like struggle with shoes all the time. Cause like if you buy the shoes already done, they're so expensive. So then you're like, oh, let me be crafty. And then I just am not crafty with shoe wear.
I've like bought shoes specifically to like destroy for cosplay, and then I've like tried them on and be like, oh, dang it, they're cute. That happened with my Harley Quinn shorts. I bought them from like Target, and then it was just like, oh no. Thought these would be ugly, but they're actually really nice. I had to buy a second pair just to have.
No, I totally understand. Does anyone have any last questions or anything? Well, thank you for the panel, Cloudysky.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Okay, so for everyone joining us, in about 3 minutes, we'll start the next panel. But thank you, Cloudysky. I also sent you a present that I forgot to give you a while ago.
Okay.
On Facebook.
I don't have Facebook on my computer, so I'll check that out.